I do have some.
You can give them to me if you want.
Okay,
Yep.
I've also got one or two I got forwarded to me, like on,
Yeah.
sorry, emailed to me on
Yeah, you
Twitter.
can just send those to me. I'll forward to Kyle. He'll do those reimbursed.
So this is a taxi
Cool.
to, well, yes, this is to the Chicago airport.
Great.
This is today's morning meal.
Okay.
And I've got two in Columbus taxis that I'm paying forward to right now.
Just forward those to me and Kyle will take care. It takes about a week or so to get reimbursed. Yep.
All the taxi drivers seem to swear these days.
Yes.
Alright, so I just sent you two of those, and I think there will probably be one more. There will be one more from Chicago. Well, no, one more to the airport and one from Chicago.
Yes.
And I'll just scan those or forward them to anything like that.
Whatever's easy for you. I got them both. Sound great. If you want me to use my phone, I can. If you want to just look at this,
I mean, just make sure you're on the Wi-Fi so you're not using your phone. Otherwise it could get very expensive.
how do I know if I'm using it?
But mine is a little, and I have other thing that I get off on Wi-Fi. Do you have an iPhone? Oh, well then you're good. If you're using Wi-Fi, you're good.
Okay.
You just don't want to be using your cell service. Good to go.
Okay, so if I sit there, the computer screen is literally in the middle, and
I
you're just
know.
going to see someone's head.
Yeah,
So I don't guess this is probably as good as it's going to be.
yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Okay, so I'll get back. So basically, what's going to start on?
Okay,
Yep.
that sounds good. And you're on here, you're doing it from the pages back.
Yes, it's over shot.
How's it going?
Okay, perfect, yeah.
Hey, thanks for the
Well, I can double
comments
check
on
online
the rip
and
talk,
make sure
by the way.
that-
Yeah, sure. This is fascinating.
Yeah, they are. So have you studied that at all? Like you said, like you had some.
Don't speak Farsi or not Farsi, so
Yeah, me too.
kind of is like a
I'm not from.
third party. Yeah, I'm following this.
Yeah.
I'm not really a.
So you're a Middle East guy. Yeah.
Another golf is my watch.
I mean, it's not clear to me that anybody's doing it. Has that great sense of this.
Yeah. And I follow like the Revolutionary Guard, the clips I couldn't.
Yeah.
That's crazy. It's like the Casey page, one of these weird. I don't know, there may be a few others. We have totally parallel security.
Your presentation.
Yeah.
You have like secularized, so the classic.
Last semester I went towards the end.
And then you have the dark
Now
cloud.
it's group 3.
Internal security.
Class over there.
Yeah.
It was just like,
Well, no, I can't remember. Were you still there when Michael brought up that Lent paper 10 years ago about like, why don't more states like delegate instead of like running big national armies that defend against outside threats? Why don't they just like have a bunch of crappy local militias? It's like harder to beat anyway.
What was the take on them? Like,
So it's like when you think about it, right? Like if I'm sitting here like wanting to invade an occupied country, the thing that I don't want to fight is like a very disorganized, very locally sustainable force, right? I'm happy to smash some big army, right? Like unless we're like really on, like similar, like, but like the last thing in the world is to deal with like a disorganized force.
very tough.
And so once puzzle was, why do states spend all this money on big conventional armies. When they go, they're not as good.
He started out as a classic kind of air security guy. And then burned out piece on the civil mill, the air revolution.
Yeah.
His first article, and he was,
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that explains the siege, right?
So the question I have, or the worry I have is like, don't you worry about like who, like, you want to keep the regime, right? So like, you can ask us to like, the siege and critics and all these guys, like,
Yeah.
how do you know they're gonna be loyal, right? How do you know they're not bringing the pitchforks
Yeah.
to palace? 'Cause
Well, see, that's, and I don't remember at which point you guys got, but we sort of got to like an answer for the issue that I've been dealing with.
what was that?
Yeah. Well, there are real issues with like the idea of, like, I can think of plenty of reasons why like now the siege, like, the regime will be more or less comfortable. They don't pay them their own,
I'm trying not to.
all their bankrolls.
I never before each other.
The organization is totally dependent on the state.
I mean, I'm great.
Just
It's
like
a nice day.
So
I hit like my first box.
it's not like necessarily that puzzling now.
I'll say the
That we sort of figured out like when it's really puzzling is that moment in like the early 90s when the Revolutionary Guard suppressed the violence, and then this is when the regime is probably like in as dire straits as it's been since '79. And those guys say no, they're from the same place.
Yeah.
Like they're from the place that's rioting, so the siege go in, no questions asked. It's like it's not even why don't you challenge the state? It's like why did you put yourself on the line? Particularly when you saw what happened like 10 years ago to those people who put themselves on the line for their regime.
This will be busy.
He essentially would be a
Once you
fair
get started, I'll
trust.
stick the first comment.
You could look at
Say,
both.
we're gonna look for
I'm thinking I'm just going to shift to the earlier moment because there are just real issues with the evidence for, and I think like that reflects like it's much more multicultural.
What are the conditions under which they defect?
I mean, they wouldn't even need to defect it. We just need to like just step back, like the guards did, yeah, and say this is you guys work this out. And I think this is going to solve the evidence issue that is the problem with this project. Actually, since like I started this project way back before it was really about trauma. Paul's class. It wasn't my thesis, no, it was just a paper I wrote for Paul's Civil War class. And he was like, this evidence is kind of garbage, you know that? I was like, yeah, that's not great.
Yeah, I mean, you may not have data that's from the trauma angle.
Yeah.
I mean, the way to do it.
I didn't watch it.
Yeah, that's what you have to do.
I read what's happening and like I came back.
Veterans of the 81 and 80s
Yeah.
and talked about like PTSD they went through and fought.
So there's
Because it's
good
nasty war.
secondary stuff on how bad that was. What like I don't have is like stuff that's demonstrating that this like narrative stuff is still going on in the siege like through today.
So what if you did, I mean, what if it was problems where you were about strategic culture, like institutional memory?
Institutional, yeah, I mean institution, like right, that's what I do. Right, I triangulate saying like we know institutions are able to transmit memory and shared learning, in their form. We're still premises we do all that. We know that trauma itself, trauma is transmissible. But yeah, I mean like if I really wanted to make this argument about like it's determining things right now, I need like exhaustive like first-hand evidence. To the point that I doubt I would really get that. Even if I somehow went there and talked with the siege, which is not exactly how I'm going to do.
Ohio.
Oh,
There's a
good.
group of Persian scholars that they do Iranian or Brits.
And he loves greeting people and sometimes get excited.
There's a lot of
He didn't know policy on the course, so he knows he gets to treat them. Greeting somebody.
Well, the leading authority on the siege is Saif al-Western. He's like the only person who's written like Western articles. And all the like, hey, there are a lot of articles about like the siege right now in the siege studies quarterly. I'm not sure about the
He
peer
is
review
11
process.
months old, we've had him for 9 months.
I mean, you could look at the way I've thought, so I look at the popular movie.
Yeah, I had an older one, we had an older one, Kira, who just went back to New York, so
How did they
most of the day Jan was working
advertise
with
their own
him,
skill
my
set
Jan was
and
working with him.
institution?
And I would take care of the
She had
office
militias
now.
in Iraq that were there.
Now he's the old
Prior to
one,
the
we're actually
war,
getting a
when we were
new
popular
puppy
militias.
on
Neighborhood protection
Thursday.
days. Wow. You these guys have a really rich evocative PR on Facebook.
Imagery,
And it's like,
or
well, we are the.
Oh, no, yeah, I mean, it's all up in
sometimes,
Oregon, right?
so
Yeah,
in
exactly.
this
It's
case,
exactly
we
the
do,
same.
Yeah, so
this
They
case
can't
we
get
do
enough of
because
it.
we raised
and the same
Yeah.
band as we're side by side.
No, I mean, that's a,
So if
I think that's a
you
big part of
raise it
both
on
its
the
original
program, then you can suggest
visceral effectiveness and its staying power, right? So it's not just out of nowhere, it's happening pre-existing here, it's in a real house, but also.
Yeah, so like the one, I mean, different angle could go you do like the Lisa Levine route and look at images and pictures and like do a really good kind of interpretive
Yeah.
study of the.
I think that's your best option if you don't want to talk to them, for sure. Like I have, actually, weirdly enough, and I don't know the story behind this, but I found like Virginia Christie, like I guess went to Iran and like, took a bunch of pictures.
Well, yeah, so she did that. She also did a really systematic survey of shared pilgrims in Nagaland.
Actually didn't read that.
Yeah, it's on her. She got I think it was USAP or
Yeah.
someone.
I knew it was for some project that wasn't like about the siege or anything, but
Yeah, I mean, she did. I think they surveyed maybe 2,000 people.
yeah,
Iraqis and Iranians going to Kabul and Najaf.
yeah.
Which is amazing. That's the first thing I'd seen. I talked to her about it. So I'm using cheese as a conjuring experiment.
Hmm.
I'm using that design for the one I want back then.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so I
Well,
was
that's
thinking about that. I
amazing.
didn't know if it would make sense. I saw her do that in this Najaf, Najaf series. Okay. Probably makes sense. She's really good.
When are you looking at? It's not on.
And it depends on the money comes through. The earliest would be probably early May.
Oh wow, that's soon.
Yeah, I'd like to run it now so I can do it. I want to present the findings now. So.
Are you gonna get out? You're off.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be in a month.
Okay.
In Jordan. I looked at when the reveal and it's with the university. Because I originally, kind of the original valences was looking at
Okay, yeah, right.
I want to go, I think, maybe the next chapter, I need to figure out kind of the next, this is the empirical portion, the data portion of it.
Just is it sort of like you sort of sense it's floating around there, there's still some like organizing
Well, this
things
is
that you
lovely, spending another night.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Well, at least it's a 50-minute flight. Yes, I will get you out.
All right.
All right. Well, it is my distinct pleasure to start off the National Security Speaker Series, which we haven't had one this year so far. So our opening 2017 Speaker Series, National Security Speaker Series, we have Paul Staniland. My name, by the way, is Randy Schweller. I never tell you that. I figure you know. I don't know why I figure that. I'm a professor of political science here at OSU. Paul Staniland, well, first of all, let me say the event is co-sponsored by the South Asia Initiative led by Brian Joseph, a distinguished university professor of linguistics, and the Kenneth E. Naylor Professor of South Slavic Languages at Ohio State. Now, Paul Staniland, I'm really happy to have him. I've heard so many good things about him. I've read his book twice. I very rarely read anyone's book twice. And particularly because it's an area I don't work in at all. His first book, it was called Networks of Rebellion, Explaining Insurgent Cohesion and Collapse. It was in Cornell University Press in 2014. Paul is an assistant professor, or are you an associate now?
I will be an associate.
Well, yes, well, see, he's been promoted already. He is an associate professor, will be, of political science at the University of Chicago, where he co-directs the program on international security policy. His research interests are in Civil War, international security, and ethnic politics, primarily in South Asia. His current book project and related articles examine organizational cohesion and fragmentation in insurgent groups. Other work studies civil-military relations, pro-state paramilitarism and civil wars, Indian and Pakistani foreign and internal security policy. You've published a couple things in that with Shumik Ganguly, right? What? Oh, Vipin Narang? Oh, I thought Shumik was your foil, but I guess not. Okay, well, Vipin, okay. Indian and Pakistani foreign and internal security policy and the politics of insurgency and terrorism. His work has been published in Civil Wars, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Security. He did his PhD in political science at MIT. Today he'll be speaking on armed politics in the state in South Asia, so please join me in welcoming Paul Staniland.
Great. Well, thanks, Randy, and thanks, everybody, for coming out. I actually was supposed to come here last year, but I got a horrible stomach flu from my son. This year, I only have a light cold, so the trajectory is upward. Maybe the next time I come here, I'll actually no longer have a toddler and be in decent health. So what I want to do today is talk about my current book project. So my first book was on insurgent group, mobilization, organizational structure. This project is a little bit more macro and hopefully bigger picture, and it's trying to understand the politics that emerge between governments and non-state armed groups. So let me start with some kind of vignettes to motivate the project. So this is, Nagaland is a tiny little sliver of northeastern India up against the Burmese border. And it's had some form of political conflict or armed conflict since 1955. The photograph on the left is one I took during fieldwork there in 2013. It's the kind of standard monument you see to a separatist insurgency. It heralds this particular Naga rebel leader for his courage, endurance, selflessness, right? He and his soldiers fought to defend the right of their people, the Naga people as a nation. So this looks like your pretty typical insurgency. But over the last 50 years or so, things have grown more complicated. The photo on your right is one of the armed encampments of one of the current Naga armed factions. Most of these groups no longer fight the Indian government. They haven't demobilized, most of them, but they're not actively, with one exception, engaged in combat operations. A number of these groups have been on ceasefire for 15 or 20 years. And so they're kind of stuck in between the classic civil war of separatist insurgency that we see on your left and what we think of as more classical demobilization, peace deals, conflict termination. Right? This is far from a unique case. In Iraq, as actually I was just talking to Austin about, we see a variety of armed actors that are not pure insurgents fighting against the government, nor have they been formally incorporated or integrated into the security apparatus. So a number of these Shiite militias, even if they're kind of ostensibly under the control of the Baghdad government, basically are free agents, often linked to Iran or powerful political parties that are not really kind of de facto part of the state's formal chain of command. In northern Iraq, we also, of course, have Kurdish armed actors that are also kind of playing their own game. So they're not classic pro-state militias, but they're also certainly not anti-state insurgents, at least right now. A final case here, and one of several in Myanmar, is the United Wa State Army, or the United Wa State Party, which is its party branch. But basically, this is kind of a narco army, a splinter of the Communist Party of Burma. It has roughly 20,000 men under arms, so as non-state armed groups go, it's pretty large, controls large swaths of territory adjoining the Chinese border, runs all kinds of interesting economic operations, often in close cooperation with Chinese officials and businessmen. And it has guns and insignia and standing forces, but with the exception of 1997, it's basically never fought the Burmese government. But it also has never signed a peace deal, and it's not going away, and it has no intention of demobilizing, at least in the foreseeable future. So these vignettes kind of beg a question. What are these? What are these cases of? There's this huge kind of cottage industry that's emerged in the study of civil war over the last 10 or 15 years in ways both good and bad. But it's been very focused on the war part of civil war, while ignoring all of these other, often, to me, more politically interesting dynamics of cooperation, containment, and collusion that these cases suggest. So I suggest that we might benefit from rethinking how we study political violence more broadly. And I introduced this kind of conceptual approach I call armed politics, basically examining the full range of political relationships, all the way from total internal wars of kind of brute force annihilation to, on the other extreme, tight alliances and cooperation between governments and armed actors. I think this is obviously important for how we think about the contemporary world, places like Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, DRC, Pakistan. But you can also find kind of at least echoes of these processes of both conflict and cooperation much deeper in kind of the history of what we now call the developed world, whether it's right-wing militias and also left-wing armed groups in especially early interwar Europe, posses, party armed wings, and various forms of militias in 19th century America, or kind of the classic relations between kings and nobles and their armies in the rise of the European modern state, right? The landscape of political violence within countries, within states, has been much more heterogeneous and varied than a lot of our assumptions can account for. So in this book project, I seek to kind of get at least some handle on how to think about variation across space and time in what I call these armed orders. And to understand this variation, today what I'm going to particularly focus on is the role of regime ideology in shaping threat perception. And so this is an effort to bring some politics back into the study of political violence, which in a lot of ways has become a kind of bland technocratic exercise. I think there's a lot of really rich politics going on, how regimes come to understand enemies, allies, and groups that lie in between. And I want to particularly point to the historical roots of a number of these threat perceptions that I think can help us understand behavior that otherwise might look puzzling or counterproductive. So I'm going to focus mostly on the conceptual and theoretical apparatus here. I'm going to sketch out some evidence, right? And I can talk in way more detail in Q&A. I've got a couple data projects going on to try to measure and map these relationships over time and space that I'd be happy to talk about. They only just got started in the last year, so I don't have like really cool graphs and stuff to show yet, but maybe someday I will. Okay, after I burn through the blood and bones of many undergraduate and grad student research assistants. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to talk about why we might want to rethink conflict. I'm going to introduce a new dependent variable, armed order, and talk about what these things are. Try to also theorize the roots of these armed orders. Talk about research strategy, provide a sketch of evidence, and then discuss some research and policy implications before opening up to Q&A. Okay? All right, so for those of you who know the Civil War and political violence literature, and for those who don't, I think while acknowledging a lot of interesting stuff has been done in the last 10 or 15 years, I think there's some important limits to what's the research that's kind of trajectory that we've seen occur or evolve. First of all, in studying how governments respond to armed groups, there's this kind of hard distinction between concession and repression that I think is overly dichotomized, right? So it's true that there are these extreme cases where you completely crack down or you concede something, you sign a peace deal, there's some kind of institutional solution to a conflict. But much of the world, much of the time, lies in between these extremes. We see dynamics of containment or collusion in which there isn't kind of clear accommodation of political grievances, nor are there hardline crackdowns. And I'll come back to what this nuanced variation looks like, but I think there's a lot of really cool stuff in between. Second, and maybe more problematically, a lot of this research focuses much more on armed actors, their organization, their interests, their strategies, than on governments. So governments are kind of taken for granted as having functionally similar interests and threat perceptions. And so maybe there's some kind of basic assumptions built in about how governments see the world, and then we kind of stop, right? There's just not much on how governments understand the world. And I think this leads to a kind of curiously apolitical style of research that I think we can do better than, or at least complement. And then finally, there's been, maybe appropriately, I don't know, but for research on political violence, there's been overemphasis on violence. So we go looking for the really violent places. And then we build inferences about our theories from observing the ones where we see death thresholds above a certain level, or we see certain kind of criteria being met, and we say, this is where our theories should apply, empirically. Right? But there's this much broader world, as I've suggested, where a lot of our theories should still be relevant. We should still be able to make interesting inferences about everything from deterrence to peace deal making in a realm where there isn't as much production of dead bodies happening. And so I think we can study both of these at the same time. And so that's what I try to do here. So what I do is focus on what I call armed orders. These are different political relationships between governments and armed groups. I think they take several different forms. So, and you can see kind of I've got an IR background here, so some of this is just kind of being, IR people will see this pretty clearly, what this looks like. Alliances, usually less formalized than in the international context, right? But basically tight mutual policy coordination towards shared objectives. This is often your classic pro-state militia, which is operating hand in glove with regime security forces, or the armed wing of a ruling party that's closely coordinating with regime elites about, who to ethnically cleanse in the run-up to elections, or how to purge dissidents. So this captures some important subset of group-state relations. Then we have actually a big category of what I'm calling here limited cooperation, which is not a great phrase. If people have a better one, please let me know. But basically, these are live and let live deals and ceasefires, spheres of influence between governments and armed groups, in which they're kind of rules of the road that limit mutual conflict, but usually in a pretty kind of hands-off way. So this would be, for instance, the WA State Army that was one of the initial groups I led off with. Basically, the Burma Army can't go in the places this group controls. This group does not generally attack the Burma Army, and so they kind of leave each other alone, for the most part, with some noise on the margins, right? And then finally, we have fighting or hostilities, and I think these come into interesting subtypes. The most obvious and extreme is what I call total war. These are high-intensity conflicts in which regimes devote large effort to the destruction of armed groups. Sometimes these lead to very long, brutal civil wars. Sometimes they're actually pretty quick, but brutally effective purges. So it's not necessarily identical to conflict duration. Then we also see these containment hostilities, which are basically low-level wars of violence management rather than violence monopolization. So for instance, there are all these armed actors in the United States, right? Right-wing militias, street gangs, all of these groups that kind of challenge in some way the monopoly of state violence. And yet, for the most part, the American federal government just keeps an eye on them and kind of seeks to keep them below some threshold of activity and lethality, right? Basically, dealing with these groups is priced into the cost of governance rather than massive efforts at total violence monopolization. And there are lots of relationships like this, both in the developed and the developing world. How do these orders come to an end? Two ways, generally. The most obvious is when a group collapses, and so this kind of dyadic relationship just stops existing. Occasionally, rebel groups win. This is pretty rare in terms of the overall scope of civil war conflict outcomes. It does happen sometimes. Less dramatically, you sometimes see states collapse in particular regions and secession occurring. Usually, though, this is groups collapsing. And then the other way that armed orders come to an end is through incorporation. This could be formal, through peace deals and DDR, demobilization. I can never figure out which goes first. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or vice versa. But in any case, kind of more formalized processes of group demobilization. There are also lots of informal forms of integration, especially with kind of militias and armed political parties, or local private armies as well, that can kind of get put on payroll or integrated into mainstream politics without formal deals being signed. So a nice example is in the Philippines, these local private armies sometimes just kind of get handed some guns, money, and uniforms, and they come up with an acronym, and these guys are all of a sudden part of an auxiliary force of whatever the Philippine National Constabulary or whatever security force we're talking about. So there are lots of ways to kind of bring groups into politics, into mainstream normal politics, that involve some kind of disarmament, whether formal or informal. Okay. So that's kind of the new dependent variable. This is a way of tracking these groups across levels of violence that right now we're going to be missing if we're focused too much on periods of violence. So just a couple examples. You don't need to, the details here are not going to be easy to understand, and most of you won't care, but a couple case examples of what these data can look like in a very, very simple setup here. So this is Karachi in Pakistan, Pakistan's biggest city. The MQM, the Muttahida Qawmi movement, is this big armed political party that has both fought the Pakistani government, whether civilian or military forms, but also during large periods done business with it, allied actually quite closely with it. And so what I've done is just year on year try to figure out what is the armed order here, okay? And so you see periods of alliance, you see collapses of these cooperative arrangements into fighting, especially the early mid-90s. So the early 90s shows up in some of our Civil War data sets, though not others for reasons that I don't fully understand. And then after these big periods of fighting, we see long periods of either limited cooperation or alliance, right? And then things get kind of noisy and bumpy again after the fall of Pervez Musharraf. So this lets us look at the whole life cycle of this relationship, both in periods where there's active civil war and also in periods in the early 2000s when the MQM is operating as the enforcer for Pervez Musharraf in Karachi. Basically, they're given the city and told to stabilize it as Musharraf tries to kind of manage his somewhat shambolic military regime. Going back to the Nagaland example I started off with, I did the same thing for a bunch of extremely obscure Naga groups that I suspect nobody in this room has ever heard of. But that's part of this process. It's also going back into history and finding groups and periods of interaction that most political scientists just don't know about or don't care about. So what we see is periods of fighting, that's these triangles, We also see peace deals, that's these X's for incorporation. We see long ceasefires. We see groups collapsing. We see groups allied with the government. So even in this tiny little sliver of Northeast India, you see all kinds of really complex, heterogeneous state-armed group relations that we can systematically track using qualitative research and historical research. So I think this is a way of kind of bringing together area studies sensibility with kind of comparisons across and within cases. Okay, so that's kind of, I hope, some value added, just in terms of conceptualization and then the empirics that come out of that. But how do we then think theoretically about this, right? How can we understand which kinds of groups are likely to be targeted for containment as opposed to total war, as opposed to deal making, as opposed to something else, right? And so this is obviously still very much a work in progress, but an important one. In terms of the book, right? Getting a theory, well, actually right now I have 2 theory chapters, which may be a theory chapter too many, but I'm still working this through. Several important scope conditions. First, this is a story about relatively coherent central governments that can have some kind of strategy that can deploy forces in some coordinated way against internal armed actors. I don't think I have a lot to say about failed states where there's no real central security apparatus that's doing things, or states where there are multiple security forces that are doing completely different, clashing, rival things, right? So this is not, I think this will not tell you much about Somalia, for instance. Second, I'm focused on central government, national or federal government interactions. There's lots of really interesting dynamics that occur with street-level police or local bureaucrats and politicians looking the other way, being corrupt and kind of doing business with insurgents, having political sympathies with them. So there's a lot of these local level dynamics that I think are important. I don't have the methodological or field experience, or methodological tools or field work experience to get at those, and I think theoretically they're probably going to be driven by some pretty different things. And then finally, I'm focused here on armed actors. I could imagine some aspects of this traveling to dissident movements, trade unions, democratizing movements, basically any context in which regimes are kind of trying to figure out who their enemies are, which groups are need to be purged or contained. But right now I focus on armed actors, so that's a scope condition. Okay. So the basic kind of the way I'm thinking about this right now theoretically is that all governments need to categorize armed groups, right? They need to make sense of the politics of these actors. Who are these people, right? Who are the groups that are really unacceptable that we need to get rid of? Which are the groups that are, even though they're armed, politically unproblematic, that we can happily engage in cooperation with? And then what are groups in between? Kind of unsavory, but tolerable, right? So I'm going to call these categorizations armed group political roles. And I'm going to suggest that they're often not obvious or natural. They're going to vary quite dramatically from regime to regime, sometimes over time within the same country as governments rise and fall. So this is going to be a story about internal threat perception in a pretty important way. I'm going to focus here on regime ideological projects as shaping perceptions of groups' acceptability. There's also this kind of tactical dynamic I'll talk a little bit more about later. It's kind of boring, it's important, but it's not particularly innovative. It needs to be there, but it's not as, I think, interesting as the kind of ideological argument. So what I do in the book right now is I've got this kind of typology. So most of my work involves building boxes and putting cases in them. And this falls pretty clearly within that. So what we can see, and I'll unpack these dimensions, but groups basically having different ideological affinities to regimes and then being more or less useful to governments, right? So this kind of combination of tactical and then more deeply strategic motivations facing regimes. And what you get is this, I think, potentially useful typology of armed group political roles, right? So groups that are ideologically aligned that could be useful or not, these armed allies or superfluous supporters, ideologically opposed groups that are either going to be strange bedfellows or mortal enemies that need to be wiped out and are targeted with total warfare. And then this interesting in-between category that I call these gray zone groups, borrowing from the sociologist Javier Ayero, I think his name is, that's how it's pronounced. But basically these are groups that are kind of in between, and I'll talk more about these. But this is where a lot of our interesting armed politics is going to happen, between these poles of total alignment and total opposition. And so you can see the rise of business partners or these undesirable armed groups targeted for either limited cooperation or kind of low-level containment over long periods of time, right? And I think we can take this typology and contextually adjusted for kind of regime ideology and operational needs, we could take it and apply it to a bunch of different places, right? So we could put the Peshmerga in certain categories in Iraq, or the different Islamist factions in Pakistan, or right-wing militias in the U.S. right? There are a whole bunch of ways in which we can make this framework travel across kinds of cases that otherwise are studied in isolation from one another. So let's talk a little bit more about the argument. So this is basically kind of an ideational argument about how regimes understand politics, right? And I think one of the reasons ideas become very important in domestic politics is because the range of action is much less constrained than in a lot of the international system, right? You see a whole variety of political projects within countries across the ideological spectrum, across any dimension of ambition, right? So there's a lot of potential room to maneuver within countries. And that's going to make, I think, ideology and ideas more important within borders than necessarily across them, right? Here I'm focusing on a very particular subset of what we might think of as ideology. I call it an ideology of the polity. Usually this is nationalism. There are some countries or regimes that don't actually, like, is ISIS really a nationalist project? Not really. So I use polity a little bit more broadly, but usually it's nationalism. These are regime beliefs about the boundaries of the polity, who's in and who's out, and then the hierarchy of categories within it. Who are first-class citizens, and then who are the kind of people who are second-class citizens, guests on our land, people who we can tolerate but who are not, truly part of the nation. These are going to generate assessments and beliefs about legitimacy, the legitimacy of different claims, symbols, types of behavior from armed actors, right? So these are ways of kind of politically reading type from armed group behavior and especially from armed group rhetoric. Now, I want to argue that this doesn't drop from the sky. It's not this kind of constructivist magic that just appears and informs political preferences, but is often, especially in the post-colonial world, deeply rooted in historical projects, and especially the development of what Sherry Berman calls carrier movements. These can be anti-colonial or democratizing movements that emerge and develop political preferences and beliefs prior to taking power. Insurgent and successful revolutionary groups, right, that need to develop an agenda, a project, before a seizure of power, and then in some cases Praetorian militaries, right? In these processes of mobilization, preparing to seize power, hoping to seize power, they're forced to come up with ideas about politics and about boundaries in particular that provide a loose and rough map of the political landscape within a country, right? What are the social blocks? What are the kinds of ideas? What are the kinds of discourses that will be more and less acceptable within the new polity? So this is going to help us generate ideological fit. And so by looking historically at moments prior to the capture of power, it gives us a way of measuring, at least loosely, kind of ideological projects prior to the first state armed group interactions that we start seeing after a seizure of power, right? So let's just kind of root this historically and understand where these projects come from and where they came from, how they emerged. Something I find is they're often very contingent, right? So I'll talk a little bit about the rise of Indian nationalism. There are a bunch of ways that could have gone as of 1931, and for a variety of very contingent reasons, it ends up in one particular direction that then becomes institutionalized and sticks in a very important way from 1947. So this is kind of just mapping what that part of the typology, aligned, gray zone, and opposed groups, right? So aligned groups are armed. They fragment the state's monopoly of violence, but the regime doesn't view them as a legitimacy problem. These are perfectly acceptable forms of armed actor. Opposed groups are seen as existentially incompatible, right? The existence of these people is in of itself a threat. They levy demands and discourses that need to be purged from the body politic. The existence of ideologically opposed groups, I think, helps us understand state repressive campaigns that seem wildly counterproductive or out of kind of objective material proportion to the kind of threat posed, right? So the kind of fears, deep fears of fifth columns within often come out of groups that are seen as really alien and impossible to do business with. And then there are these groups in the gray zone, not ideologically aligned, but also not levying incompatible or existentially threatening demands. Okay. Now, within these broad political contexts, then there's this whole tactical strategic interaction game that's also occurring. And I've got a chapter in the book that is trying to unpack this right now, or a draft chapter, a very bad draft chapter. But, conditional on political categorization, you also need to make judgments about kind of tangible political tasks. We need to win an election. We have an insurgency we need to defeat. Are these groups going to be useful for those tasks or not, right? So given some kind of broader ideological categorization, then we fill in this typology with these operational incentives, or these tactical incentives, right? Armed groups can be really helpful for doing all kinds of things within countries. Some of it's your standard counterinsurgency, repression stuff, but also winning elections or targeting nearby countries can also be operationally very valuable. And one interesting thing here is ideological sympathy and operational effectiveness are not kind of mapped onto one another perfectly. They're obviously related, but there's distance where we can see groups that are, ideologically completely sympathetic to the regime, but are basically useless. They're like 3 guys, an AK-47, and a fax machine. They can't do anything for the government. There are also groups that, conversely, that are quite militarily powerful. They have deep reach into social constituencies the regime can't access, but they live in the gray zone or are even ideologically opposed. So they can do things for the government, right? Bargains can be struck. There may be mutual interest to be pursued, but against the backdrop of deep political disagreements. And so this is how we end up with these business partner and strange bedfellow political roles with groups that are not particularly ideologically aligned, but that share some mutual interests. So, for instance, in the early 1980s, late 1970s, parts of the Indian elite in the Congress Party prop up this group of Sikh religious radicals. Why do they do this? They do this to try to break a regional political party that is seen as a potential threat against the backdrop of Mrs. Gandhi losing power and then coming back. Anyways, they think they can manage these guys, right? And so they treat them as strange bedfellows. They support them. They withhold state repression. Now, eventually, this totally blows up, right? And they shift over here. And this is what triggers the Sikh insurgency of 1984 to 1993. But for a while, there was kind of a limited tactical alignment of interest, despite this deeper political kind of disagreement about, the meaning of Indian nationalism and who could be incorporated within it. In Syria, we've actually seen the Assad regime for a while was kind of leaving ISIS alone. Even though there are obviously deep ideological disagreements, they both had kind of bigger fish to fry. And so you saw limited cooperation as they targeted kind of whatever you might want to think of as the moderate parts of the rebellion. Right. So this is a way in which we can get these kind of these interesting relationships of cooperation despite ideological disagreement. Okay. So this hopefully fleshes out a little bit of this typology and gives us a map that we can take out into the world and kind of assign groups to. Also, this is going to help us understand change over time. Right. So we can see relatively minor shifts within these ideological categorizations. For instance, groups that were very useful for fighting a counterinsurgency stop being useful once the insurgency's been defeated, and they may now be viewed as superfluous supporters to be absorbed into mainstream politics, right? Or vice versa, as this undesirable group may become newly valuable, newly useful in the face of new electoral contexts. We can see a shift in armed order kind of along that horizontal dimension. Those are going to be pretty common, but kind of fluid and tactical. The more interesting to me shifts are in the kind of foundational ideologies of regimes and the ideological positioning of armed groups, the kind of demands they're levying, the positions they're staking out in the political system. And I can talk in a lot more detail about where those come from. I've been working on that right now. But in particular, regime changes within countries, and then also processes of group radicalization and moderation that are born from internal fragmenting or splitting fragmentation and from different kinds of state strategies. So that the dynamics of change over time are complicated and interesting. And I think I'm basically going to devote a chapter of, I think I'll have a theory chapter that is kind of the deep historical foundations of ideological assessment, and then a second theory chapter that's about these trajectories of armed order over time, right? As governments and armed groups adapt to one another and engage in these strategic interactions. Okay. So empirically, I'm not going to do a deep dive into all of these various South Asian cases that are my focus, but I want to give a kind of broad sense of what I'm doing here. So right now, there are kind of 3 layers to the research design. There's a big cross-national study of post-colonial South Asia. So looking in the colonial period to understand the different nationalist projects that emerged and the ones that won, and the counter movements that didn't win but survived into independence, the alternatives that sometimes took over time or that kind of posed the primary threat, alternative vision of the nation after independence. And so I trace out both regime ideological project and also patterns of internal security policy in India, Pakistan, Burma, and Sri Lanka. And I might add Bangladesh to this at some point. So kind of big picture differences in how governments think about internal security and the kinds of armed orders that we see developing over time in these countries. Then I jump into really nitty-gritty subnational comparative cases, looking at multiple armed groups over time and their interactions with the state in parts of India's northeast, Pakistan's northwest. And I think Burma's northeast, though there are like dozens of groups wandering around, most of which I can get almost no information on. So I'm going to have to think harder about what the Burma comparisons look like. But this is to really fill out the typology and kind of see where it has bite, where the argument has bite, and where I'm getting things just wrong, right? Looking for substantial mispredictions that I can use to kind of come up with interesting ideas for future research. I'm also thinking about doing some stuff on Cold War Southeast Asia, kind of where you see armed orders changing after regime changes and where you don't. And I can talk about that if people are interested in Q&A. Okay, so what am I doing here? So I've got some money to basically do new case studies and quantitative data collection on these state group relationships over time throughout South Asia. So we have dozens of these armed groups that we're doing research on. So some of it's very simple quantitative data, basically kind of coding in each year what the relationship is with relevant covariates. Also, we're writing up new cases with specialist bibliographies, basically because most political scientists in America don't pay any attention to most of the groups that I care about, and I want to at least give them an opportunity to learn about them, or if they want to put them in a data set or do case study research on them, kind of as a starting point for that kind of work. Especially for measuring ideology, I've been doing a lot of qualitative historical research, particularly thus far in the colonial period of South Asia, and then in the 1940s and 1950s, as kind of new ideas of state and nation are being put into action, and debates over these ideas of the nation are occurring with real ferocity. There's some subnational data I can talk about, but it's not central to today's presentation. And then over the years, I've done field interviews in a variety of places to try to kind of get a fine-grained sense of how these armed orders operate. Like what do they look like operationally? Who does what to who? What are the kind of rules of engagement? How do they shift? How do people on the ground understand them, right? Are they thought of in these terms? And those have been really useful for kind of more of a bottom-up understanding of what these different landscapes of violence look like, these kind of topographies of order from the local level. So let me talk just really briefly for a few minutes here about how we might use this to understand differences between India and Pakistan in overall internal security posture, right? India and Pakistan are structurally kind of emerged from very similar foundations in the British Raj. They're both poor countries that begin as democracies in a very unsettled, bloody late 1940s period. Yet I'm going to argue they end up adopting radically different internal security postures, okay? So despite structural similarities, how do we end up in these different security postures? So this requires actually going way back starting really in the 1880s to understand how different carrier movements emerged. These are nationalist projects. How do they articulate the boundaries of the nation? What kind of ideas would be at the heart of whatever aspirational future nation state these movements were demanding? So what I do is I look at the winners, the Indian National Congress, the Muslim League, which will take over Pakistan, the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League, AFPFL, which takes over Burma in 1948, and the Ceylon National Congress, which becomes the United National Party, which becomes the founding regime of Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, in 1948. I also look at the kind of the losers in this period, the paths not taken, but that nevertheless survived into the post-independence period. So this would be regionalist movements in Pakistan, communists and Hindu nationalists in India, and especially kind of ethnic minorities and federalists in Burma, right? And so what this is useful for, looking at the paths not taken, I think is useful for two things. First, it suggests that what did end up happening was not obviously functionally necessary, right? There were other people who radically disagreed with the direction that nationalist formation was taking, and that offered perfectly plausible accounts of how, a very different structure of politics could have emerged. But second, some of these survivors then end up taking power later, right? So we see a shift in ideological project later as these movements are able to kind of make a long march, whether through the institutions or through the electorate, to eventually impose a new vision of politics. So this would be, for instance, the rise of Sinhalese nationalism in Sri Lanka, the rise of the Burmese army and its particular Burmese nationalism in Burma, and the Hindu nationalist movement in India, right, which has taken power both in the late 90s and now since 2014. So we get these contending ideological projects. I try to measure as best I can along different dimensions, how they think about caste, tribe, language, and religion, right? How are they viewing the relationship of the nation to those four primary dimensions or cleavages of politics? And what this requires doing is dealing with the South Asia historiography. I don't know if there are any historians in the room, but the South Asia historiography is like a total shatter zone of people who hate each other and have also decided historiography is kind of a colonialist project laden with hegemonic implications. So I've actually had to kind of rebuild some of this to kind of come up with defensible, coherent accounts of these movements. So at 30,000 feet up, what do we see in India and what do we see in Pakistan? Again, this is doing enormous violence to a lot of complexities. We see a lot of elite consensus within the Indian National Congress about several things. First, linguistic politics, tribal politics, and caste politics will be at least acceptable. The kind of things you can talk about in polite political company, the kinds of demands that can be made in the political system, fairly legitimately. There's going to be much more limited but still existent acceptance of leftist redistribution, which is quite different than a lot of other post-colonial regimes where the left is viewed as completely unacceptable. And then a really profound resistance to minority religious political mobilization, especially any kind of separatism linked to either Muslims or Sikhs. And this is because of the history of competition between the Congress and the Muslim League and the legacies of the partition of India and Pakistan, right? You cannot have a replay of partition in the eyes of the Congress and in the eyes of Indian elites. The big contested, ambiguous strand is the relationship between Hinduism and the Indian nation. This is one that's continued to the present day. This is why Hindu nationalism has become such an important, powerful force, right? Because there was no hegemonic consensus that was imposed in 1947. There were no losers who were purged completely from the public or private sphere. In Pakistan, we see quite a different set of consensus, quite a different consensus congeal, both among civilian elites, a lot of civilian elites in West Pakistan, and especially within the Pakistani military, also a West Pakistani institution. Deep resistance to ethno-linguistic and leftist redistributive demands, again, because of historical legacies, the problems that both the left and ethno-regionalism presented for the consolidation of the idea of Pakistan during the colonial period, and a more, but greater acceptance of particularly Islam-based or Muslim-based demands, whatever form those took, right? The idea of Pakistan as a Muslim homeland. So making demands on that dimension, on that basis, are seen as more legitimate than on these other dimensions that are seen as vociferous threats to the idea of Pakistan. Nevertheless, there are deep ambiguities about the relationship of Muslim or Islam to the nation that have been the primary, or a primary form of contested politics since 1947 that continue to the present day. So what do these lead to? I want to suggest they lead to very radically different internal security postures, despite structural similarities in lots of other domains, especially things like per capita GDP that a lot of people in the literature point to as a proxy for state capacity, right? So despite looking very similar in terms of historical legacies, economic development, and in some periods actually levels of democracy, you see kind of opposite security postures, right? They come to view threats very differently. The kind of political space, both for accommodation and the resolve for repression, end up looking exactly opposite, though with some changes I can talk about. So basically you see radically repressive crackdowns against religious minority groups, separatist armed groups, right? But much more political space for various kinds of ethno-linguistic and tribal separatists. This whole world of limited cooperation and containment out in Northeast India, and even kind of a pretty relaxed posture against the radical left as well. So mostly containment against the Maoists, with a couple of exceptions. So basically the key threats that are perceived are a rerun of partition in which kind of Muslim or Sikh insurgents would break apart the very idea of India. By contrast, the Pakistanis really go after exactly the people that the Indians are most likely to contain or cut deals with, ethno-linguistic separatists, right? These are the deepest political threat because they herald a return to the problems that Pakistani nationalists had in building the very idea of a Pakistani nation, which is, we may all be Muslims, but beyond that, shared political interests are pretty limited. So issues of especially language and region really bite into this nationalist construction. By contrast, Islamist armed groups are treated in a very heterogeneous array of ways, depending on some more fine-grained characteristics I can talk about, right? Whether they stay within these particular red lines that security managers have set out. So there's way more high variance. There's much more variance when it comes to security policy toward Islamists, whereas kind of a real clustering toward total war and pretty brutal crackdowns toward ethno-linguistic separatists. We've actually got some data on military operations and peace deals toward Islamist groups in Pakistan's northwest frontier. You can see there are groups like the Pakistani Taliban that are getting both lots of military operations and lots of peace deals. So it's kind of this effort to figure out what type these guys are, which red lines they're willing to follow and which they're not. That you see nothing like that for the ethno-linguistic categories. They're basically cracked down on kind of really radically, very quickly. Okay. So that's just a sketch. I'm happy to talk much more in Q&A about this. But we've got a couple of different ongoing empirical steps, so a lot more case studies and quantitative data collection. I've been trying to get a lot more primary source evidence that I can talk more about, but really it stops in the 60s in most of these cases, so the 40s and 50s are really where the primary sources are right now. Though some of the Indian sources are starting to get declassified into the 70s, though they're in the National Archives of India, which is like not an easy place to get anything out of. ironically enough. And then I've got some other related work. Okay, so let's talk about some implications, then open up for Q&A. So research implications. I think one big takeaway is that there isn't this dichotomy between this Hobbesian war of all against all versus some kind of happy Max Weberian monopoly of legitimate violence. Most politics in most of the world lies between these extremes, and that's where we need to reorient a lot of our study of internal security and civil and political conflict, right? Second, the way that mainstream politics is understood by governments is historically contingent and historically constructed. Okay, so what seems totally normal and acceptable in one country or for one group of regime elites may look completely different in another one. And we need to understand those differences rather than just assuming that all governments think about security the same way and are similarly sensitive to the same to different kinds of armed groups. Okay. And then finally, I think intellectually there's an opportunity to really integrate the study of political violence across civil war, state building, or electoral violence, right? So instead of these silos that we've seen develop in the last few years, I think this at least provides an opportunity to break some of those down and integrate a lot of what we're seeing under, I think, a broader conceptual framework. Okay, finally, some policy implications. One big takeaway for me, at least, is that there are a lot of, or at least there are several different ways to end up with a sustainable political order in contexts that have been affected by disorder and conflict, right? Often, indeed, large-scale state building and kind of the attempts to create either kind of a Hobbesian or Weberian state are going to lead to backlash, mobilization, and resistance. So in a lot of cases, limited cooperation or containment are going to be much safer, smarter strategies for political order and stability than this kind of state-building uber alles strategy that was all in vogue in Washington about 10 or 12 years ago, right? That was also linked to this kind of more liberal project of state building and neo-trusteeship and all this stuff, right? I think the evidence suggests that's a very, actually quite dangerous policy prescription and one that in a number of contexts can backfire quite dramatically. So in terms of foreign intervention, sometimes reducing ambition, doing business with local power holders is a smarter strategy than attempting to kind of build a state. It comes with costs, so there are trade-offs here, but I want to at least get that out there, right? Second, I think we need to take government's threat perceptions a lot more seriously. So American policymakers would kind of bang their head into the wall trying to talk sense into Hamid Karzai or the Pakistani military or Prime Minister Maliki in Iraq and say, what are these people doing? They must be idiots or just not understand the world. In fact, these are smart people who are trying to make sense of the threats they face. They obviously or often understand those threats differently than outsiders do. And whether we agree or disagree with those perceptions, I think we need to understand much better where they come from rather than just being frustrated with these kind of, irreconcilable locals who won't do what we say they should. And then finally, I think this provides one way of measuring state power in a more fine-grained way, looking at these relationships that will help us understand where the state is stronger and weaker across space and time, at least when it comes to this issue of kind of armed politics and political order. I think this is a way of kind of disaggregating state power and looking at the various ways that states can actually deploy or not deploy their capacity across territory. So I've talked for a while and hopefully thrown out some interesting ideas. And so I look forward to any questions you guys might have. Okay, here and here.
Thanks, Paul, for the talk. So it was interesting you mentioned your IR background and kind of how that influenced the typology. What do you think the role of great powers is in the international community? This is a very comparative talk, but it seems to me that a lot of these, particularly in the gray zone areas or the oppositional groups, great powers get a vote, and foreign states will interfere either through proxies or either through proxy war or through formal avenues of security assistance to affect outcomes within countries, right, within regions that the United States or Russia or China would care about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually become more IR friendly in the last few weeks as I've been working on a chapter. So I think where IR really matters is in a couple places. First, a lot of armed groups are going to be looking to the international system for support, especially relatively weak groups that are dependent on external actors. And there, I think the way they position themselves ideologically will often really hinge on what external sponsors want. Now, I think this is going to be less true for powerful, kind of domestically robust armed groups that can kind of tell outside sponsors to take it or leave it. So like the Tamil Tigers, they were happy to burn the Indians, regardless of what the Indians wanted. But lots of groups aren't the Tamil Tigers. And so if outside sponsors want them to radicalize and really go after the regime, they're going to be forced to do it. If they want them to moderate, like you saw at the end of the Cold War with lots of leftist armed groups, then they're kind of forced into a more conciliatory posture. So I think that's going to really matter on the armed group side, and it's going to drive a lot of the change. So this is one of the big mechanisms I'm looking at for change over time. Second, I think external politics are meddling, I think it can, in fact, it definitely can influence regime threat perceptions. So I think it would not surprise me if externally backed groups, on average, or kind of on the margin, are viewed as slightly more threatening than groups that are not. I think that's going to still be pretty contingent on these domestic politics, right? So, for instance, in India, lots of these ethno-linguistic separatist types got tons of Pakistani support, but the Indians they understood that was just a tactical relationship. It didn't have deeper significance. So it kind of acted as a little bit of a threat accelerant, but it wasn't a huge deal. In other contexts, though, where I think domestic cleavages and international support line up, right? So Pakistanis backing Muslim separatists, then I think that just shoots things even farther through the roof. So I think the international context matters more than this talk gave it credit for. I just didn't really have time to get into all of that, but I'm trying to sneak international politics in through some of these mechanisms that are kind of compatible with this framework. Dan?
Yeah, I already told you I thought it was cool, so I think it's cool. I think the main reaction I had actually seeing the talk after reading the paper is that it looks to me like you have basically two big projects here. I mean, the first project is a huge swing. It's really cool. This entire reconceptualization in terms of foreign politics, and let's rethink the DV, and then you also give a major explanation for the DV. It sounds like that's how the book's going to proceed, and it's going to be a cool book. But
What's the DV?
the DV is sort of armed orders. What do you call
Yeah,
them?
these armed orders.
You could say relationships between groups and
And what's the explanation?
ideology. I guess.
Ideology.
This ideology, like historical liberated ideology explanation. So I think that, but I would urge you not to lose sight of selling those separately also, because I think you can sell the first one in a big way to the Creo crowd. But as far as, I've had comments on each of them, but in the interest of time, I'll just say the one that's more in my mind. As far as the ideological explanation, how do you know if and when ideology is in sort of a veneer for other types of decision making? And you can think of this at the state level. I'm particularly thinking of it at the group level, right? So groups, if they're strategic, are going to just shift in their ideology to fit with what's acceptable by the state. And it sounds so, can they do that? It happens a lot. And the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, for example, is arguably just an Apache nationalist organization. Its support levels are vastly higher among Pashtuns. It's largely made up of Pashtuns, its leadership. So, I mean, have they just outsmarted the other Pashtun nationalist groups? And, I mean, I guess they don't all do this, but it raises that question.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is kind of, I agree, there's a lot going on here, probably too much. But, second books, it's like, you've got to write them to, and ideally they're going to be better than the first book. So I thought it was worth trying to push a lot into this. I might end up kind of peeling some of it out. In terms of reconceptualizing the political violence stuff, I didn't think that was enough for a book project. I thought it was some cool articles, but I thought the obvious question, it just begs the question, so what's driving some of this variation? So that's why I've tried to push them together, but I take your point. So this is a great question. Why don't groups just kind of read the regime and then figure out kind of what's going to be acceptable and make demands on that basis, right? Why engage in costly, inefficient conflict when, you can just move yourself into the gray zone or be acceptable? And I think there are a few things going on here. I think in the early periods of new regimes, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the actual rules of the road are. So you can see conflicts that basically develop because you're not really sure what the red lines are, right? In some cases, those are going to endogenously spiral, where basically you get some really nasty fighting, people get really upset, and it becomes more difficult to trust the other side, more difficult to kind of move into a more cooperative equilibrium. So I think that's one dynamic where you get, things could have gone differently in the first few years in independent Burma, for instance, with huge repercussions for the next 60. So some of it's just early misperception that then creates path dependence. But more deeply, I think a lot of these groups, so let me say two things about group ideological positioning. One is, while there are changes, I don't think they're super fluid. I think in the data I've seen, most groups change once or twice. That's about it. And I think that's in part because they're really restrained by both civilians and also by other members of the organization. So for instance, if you're the Provisional IRA and you've been fighting for 25 years, it's going to be hard. There's a lot of work's going to be necessary to moderate your posture, right? You've been socializing people into a pretty hardline war aims, getting them to take risks, kind of selling to civilians what the ultimate outcome is going to be, and then saying, well, actually, we want to move into the gray zone. We're going to be totally fine with British support, with British domination. You can do it, but it's going to be really, I think, actually more difficult than just kind of shifting along some spectrum very easily. I think there are big internal constraints that are built in. And that's why a lot of this is a very slow process of ideological change when it does happen. I think a lot of the movement from getting beaten up into basically moving toward the government is a war weariness mechanism, where you've been fighting, you're not getting major political concessions, but the government is willing to talk to you under certain conditions. And so you say, fine, we're gonna take some kind of deal, even if it's just one of these spheres of influence or ceasefires, right? But even that will take a pretty substantial quite a while. The other thing, though, is I think a lot of civilian populations and armed group actors don't want to play the state's game. They think if they hold out, they can impose sufficient costs on the government to force it to change, or there's going to be some exogenous shock that's going to open a new opportunity for them to get their more maximalist war aims. So I've talked to Kashmiri dissidents who are like, well, when China and India have a war, that will be our opportunity. So as long as we can kind of maintain resistance at a low level, then we can take advantage of a major shift in the future that will kind of reconfigure the landscape we face. So I think while this is kind of a state-centric project, I think we want to keep in mind that there's a lot of armed group agency here, but it's going to be constrained by a lot of hardliners and civilian populations that are not interested in just following whatever rules the regime is laying out. So I think that explains some of what's happening in terms of this messy, inefficient conflict stuff. Yeah. Chris in the back.
Hey, I really enjoyed the talk, so thank you very much. I have two questions. One is, unlike Dan, I'm actually going to ask you to broaden the book out and be even more expansive so you can do research for more years, or maybe over your third book. But I'm wondering actually about the consequences of these different categories. Instead of we were talking about the causes of them, and this is DVs, I'm thinking about them as independent variables. In particular, if you thought at all about what the consequences of these different categories are for the ability of the state to function. So, for example, if we think about something like the limited cooperation cell, how much different is that from alliance, say, relative to low-level hostilities and containment in terms of, can the state continue to function in terms of providing services to its people, having economic development, all that sort of stuff? How much does it matter for the state to function in these different categories? That's question one. And question two is, in the lower left corner, you have the high operational utility opposed and the strange bedfellows there. I mean, I guess I could see that as one possible outcome, but I wonder why that doesn't become basically an intractable or sustained civil war, right? So the lower right would be a civil war where you just wipe them out, but the lower left, it seems to me, could easily end up with, I don't know what, Cyprus? I don't know.
Right, that's interesting.
And then maybe those are the cases of just intractable.
So that gets to this, what is this operational utility?
Okay, so should I take that with this?
I have another question. I have a separate question.
Okay.
It's related, but let's answer it.
Sure. Okay, so the first part is consequences. I haven't done systematic research on this, but here's my sense. I think it's going to be really hard for the state to do much of anything here. This is kind of wartime. A lot of people are getting displaced and killed. Here, I think a lot of what you see in these kind of limited cooperation dynamics is a lot of corruption, patronage. The government's just kind of dumping money into these areas that its local allies are going to use, and the government's going to keep a pretty hands-off posture. They don't care what happens to it. This is how, there's all this stuff on development and its effect. In most of these war zones, development is a way to pay off combatants, or to buy people, or to hold on to loyal bureaucrats and their families. So I think in these kind of murky in-between spaces, just a lot of money disappears in very interesting ways, in very political ways, right? So you can see where it goes, but it's not like good governance and public service provision. I think in alliances, it depends on the nature of the relationship, but often states are still functioning in these areas, but they're operating kind of right next to or on top of armed actors like pro-state militias. So it's not necessarily a limit of state capacity. The state may decide not to get in the way of these militia groups, but I think they often have the capacity to do all kinds of state-like things while their allies are doing all kinds of other unpleasant things at the same time. Right, so that's just my sense. I could be wrong. Okay, so this kind of getting into this like operational utility, strange bedfellow space. So So maybe let me offer. So Strange Bedfellow is the least thought through of these, to be really honest with you. I think there's some really interesting cases where ideological enemies kind of leave each other alone in terms of actual deployment of forces, right? It might be there's deterrence going on here, though I think the cases I've seen that end up where I think there should be warfare, but they don't, is there's some tactical interest they have in common. This is really common in like really complex multi-party civil wars. So like Fotini Christia's book is all about this, for people who have read that. Basically, they may hate each other, but in these constantly shifting coalitions, and kind of a very kind of classical realist story, or maybe neoclassical realist or structuralist realist, there is some kind of realist story, you get these fluid coalitions shifting around. Right? So I think that's going to be an extreme subset of civil wars, but that may be where this mechanism has the most bite. And it may lead to stuff that looks really bizarre, like, you know, long-running conflicts with very little fighting because even though you hate each other, you both have an interest in attacking somebody else more. Though my guess is these are going to be pretty tenuous, and they're often going to break down and shift over here once whatever tactical shared interest disappears. So I would expect the Assad regime to start targeting ISIS as the threat from whatever the moderate rebel types goes down, right? So they both wanted to get rid of these guys, but now I think we have already seen more conflict between Assad and ISIS in places like Palmyra. So that's my sense of what those orders will look like. Okay, so Randy is concerned about operational utility.
I have a question.
Yeah, do you want to ask that question now?
Okay. So, first of all, I have a suggestion. Your orders, you didn't like your armed orders. I don't like the categories because I think they should be self-evident. So I think the three categories should be cooperative armed orders, coexistent, and
that's nice.
conflictual. So I mean, but I don't think that covers the water problem.
Okay.
Because I think you could have a limited, like you have cooperative and / conflictual, which wouldn't be coexistent. It would be just there are areas where we cooperate, there are areas where we conflict. So I think there's a fourth category. But anyway, so okay, so that's the first thing. I don't see like the causal distance. I'm just not seeing a causal explanation. So like I have used typologies myself, but generally you would think that there's an explanation for why things wind up in the cells that they do. And I'm just not seeing, I see like a description. You know, I could see why you could say things end up there, but like going back to Chris, like, so I think part of the equation has to do with you want to get state and politics in. I think state strength. Like, if the state is strong enough to wipe them out, they wipe them out. If the state is really sovereign, it doesn't need an alliance partner. I can't figure out why a sovereign state would ever want a separate alliance partner that's a non-state, a violent non-state actor. It's like, what do I need you for?
Sorry, when you say truly sovereign state, what do you mean by that?
A sovereign state doesn't want violent non-state actors in its territory. Because it's like, well, all right, well, I need an explanation for why. Why? I mean, the United States does not want, strong states generally don't want this. Now, I can see weak states. Go ahead.
But even the U.S., I mean, gangs control territory, and the U.S. government doesn't do anything about it. And they know, I mean, there's big areas of Columbus where there are gangs that operate, and everybody knows who they are, and everybody in the police knows who they are, and they just don't go get them because it's going to be too costly to do that. And so there aren't any, I mean, I think Paul can answer himself, but I think he would say that there aren't any such states.
Okay,
all states have these groups operating.
That these groups that do not have a legitimate, like the state has a legitimate monopoly on the use of force, but it doesn't always, but obviously it doesn't have a monopoly on the use of force.
So,
that's what you're saying. I mean, but most actors, it's just strange that an actor would legitimize an armed group like a gang. Like a state doesn't, you're saying it's just too costly to get rid of them. But we don't legitimize them, I hope. You know, I mean, I guess the government is the mob that gets it. But anyway, I need to know,
sure.
I guess I need to know, like, so state strength it seems is doing a lot. And just to go to your India-Pakistan example. So India, to me, India has more ethnicities than all of Western Europe, more languages than all of Western Europe. So India is this hugely polyglot, you know, heterogeneous state of multiple ethnicities, whereas Pakistan doesn't have that at all. And so wouldn't that be more of an, doesn't that do a lot towards explaining why you were saying the difference between Pakistan and India in this group? Like, I mean, they face very different publics, I would think. And so the problems are different. I guess what I'm thinking is that I just am not seeing, like you say the state is an actor, but I never heard you talk about what the state wants, you know, and how, you know, what kind of situations the state faces, and why then somehow you have a theory about why different orders would crop up.
Okay, so I think there are a few different things on the table. The first is I like some of those category names, so I might steal some of those with appropriate citation, especially coexistence. So, okay, so in terms of causal distance, I think part of what's going on is like a factor of what Dan was talking about, where I spend like half the talk saying like, let's rethink everything, then, oh, like, by the way, here's an argument. I could draw an arrow diagram, maybe that would help, where it's like we start with historically rooted construction political preferences, right, in carrier movements. I can tell you what those are, how they vary. Moment of taking power, new threat perception, orders that follow from that. I think that looks more causal, right? Like we start here, we go to this moment of regime formation, we can measure threat perceptions, and we can independently, I think, in a lot of cases, measure actual security force deployments.
Do you think every state, though, is going to start differently? Like you're doing all this historical contingency?
Yeah, it's like a very comparative historical...
So state interests are going to vary from every state. It's going to have different, like, sort of motivations, interests.
So I thought about clustering them. So I think, for instance, movements that are ethno-majoritarian are going to look, they're going to have family resemblances to one another. Right, so movements that develop that are kind of about reclaiming the sons of the soil, you know, reclaiming the nation for its people, probably going to end up putting certain kinds of ethnic minorities, especially peripheral minorities, in particular categories. And then I think there are these top-down projects of like state or national reformation that are usually elite-led, which is both India and Pakistan. So I've thought a little bit about how to do that. I think that's a huge theoretical task, is figuring out how nationalisms emerge. But I'm sensitive to that. It is a very like comparative historical project, though, in part to deal with your critique, which is like, well, there are no states like this, and why would any state want to do this? And I have to go into the history and say, actually, yes, like there are plenty of states that look like this, and this is why they're perfectly happy to live with these groups or even legitimize them, right? So, for instance, when Suharto takes power in 1965, there are all these armed actors wandering around, and what does he do? He legitimizes and supports them to destroy the communists. And then he doesn't demobilize them. They still stick around, they still exist today. Right? Is that because Suharto was a weak ruler? No, it's because they served a very valuable political purpose for the Suharto regime. So I think this issue of state strength is one that like IR people always give me hell about. They're like, well, no strong state would ever do that. And I'm like, no, here are 14 examples in which relatively robust regimes would be perfectly happy to live with political violence on their soil. Right? So in the contemporary case, in the US, there are tons of militias wandering around. There's Waco, you know, occasionally Ruby Ridge, you know, we do some crackdowns, but we live with these guys because they're just not seen as that big of a deal, right? The political costs necessary to really monopolize violence in the United States are just not really worth it, given the threat perception of the federal security establishment and our political elite threat perception. So Japan in the 60s and 70s, there were right-wing actors wandering around all the time that the government found perfectly useful and not particularly problematic as a way to beat up on lefty peace protesters in the 60s and 70s. Peter Katzenstein's written a lot about these guys. So even in the developed world, we can find cases that look like this. But I agree with you, they're going to be more common in the developing world. The question is going to be, you have a state with some capacity, but there are resource limitations. How do they prioritize threats? Where do they put their focus, right?
I guess this is what I'm just trying to code. It's just that I'm saying that the difference between, like, for example, low-level hostilities containment and intense hostilities total war, it may have to do with ideology, but it may have to do with that one state can actually wipe them out and the other state can't.
Well, what if I told you within a state, we've got two campaigns, same army, same political elite, same police, and in one they go for total warfare and in one they just do a hands-off thing, right? Would that be more persuasive to you?
It has to be relative to the threat state face. The
Sure.
state is strong relative to the, I'm just trying to get it simplified so
Yeah.
that there's more. I just think there has to be, I think you can get more causal power or something.
I take that point.
By looking, I think you need to look at state strength. Because, I mean, we're talking about actors on their territory that they're either going to cooperate with or they're not going to cooperate or they're going to wipe them out or they're going to limit. And it seems to me that has to be a function somewhere.
So can I just, a very brief coda of why, originally my theory had that in there, but then my realist friends in Chicago would tell me two radically different things. One is, the biggest, strongest group is the one that's going to be destroyed first, because they're the most threatened. Or, the biggest, strongest one is the one that you're not going to attack because you're deterred. And instead you attack the weakest, smallest ones because you... So I was kind of like, well, I don't know what to do with that, with power as this unmediated variable in this context. So I hear you, but I'm not exactly sure how to integrate it properly. But let's go here, then Chris wants to follow up, and then Chris Ray.
Encourage you to unpack an ideological fit of the war. It seemed to me first that you were describing the ideas that lay behind that and the preferences historically that it leads to. And I thought you were describing the conflict, not explaining it. I didn't see any theoretical link, because what you had is essentially an independent variable that was the conflict.
Okay.
So that maybe in your book you have a sharper definition of what ideology is, what it can take on in terms of various factors or dimensions of what it could look like. So there's some typology of ideology. Because what it seems like now is it's any collection of ideas that essentially express preference over a variety of different possible things. And that's why your third category down here, opposed, can create strange bedfellows, which implies log rolling, which is not ideologically. Then what you're saying is basically ideological fit is just preferences, which sometimes can be log rolled, not really ideological fit. So that's my first one. My second one, kind of what Randy was talking about, I think this operation utility just semantically is confusing.
Sure.
Because what it really is the relative power between the state and the opposition group, or the other group, the other group. And so sometimes it's pretty close, or sometimes the power distance is very, or it's kind of the ability of the opposition group to either help or hurt you.
Okay, is that power?
I don't know, relative power is what I would call it, but it's the ability of the opposition group to either help or hurt you. So it has something to do like that. That's not a big part to me, but I agree with Randy that particularly when it's high, it's only limited cooperation, but when it's low, whatever that is, you become a mortal enemy. That just sounds completely counterintuitive, right? Mortal, whatever that thing is, when it's high, you ought to be mortal enemy, and when it's low, that's just the way it just seems to be more logical to me. The last, I wanted to suggest that you could benefit, I think, a lot by embedding this more deeply in the comparative politics literature. Start with Max Weber or Amitai Etzioni, who they talk about control systems, right? And so states always use a combination of coercion, some kind of symbol manipulation, or allowing what they call normative habitual. The revenuers, like the distillers in Kentucky, go ahead and you own that hollow, we own this hollow, and it's sort of hands off as long as you let the federal government do what we're doing out. That's very similar in Afghanistan, right? It's very common. We don't mess with you as long as you don't mess with the political system. And they also use co-optation, which never shows up in your scheme, right? The ability of the state to buy off, like in Saudi Arabia, potential opponents. And it would seem to me that just those four categories of Weber and later on Etzioni, these four instruments the state uses to exercise control, would, I think, make your story easier to tell, because these are, what you're doing is you're mixing up lots of different kinds of things that states can do in terms of, and they would, the state would consider, well, can I co-opt these guys? If I can't co-opt them, maybe I'd have to coerce them. Coercing is a lot more expensive maybe than co-opting, or can I just buy them off by letting them have territorial autonomy in some, when you say we have militias running all around the country, that's not true. We have militia in certain rural areas. If they start coming to downtown Columbus and start messing around, I mean, no, they got to stay on their turf.
Right. That's.
And then we don't go hunting them down in upstate Michigan.
I agree with that.
But if they come in Ann Arbor, so they're not actually running around. We gave them their hollow. They got to stay in that little valley, that little place. You ride your hogs out there and leave us alone.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with that. They don't pose the kind of political challenge that makes it worth it to really go after them, but we're a strong sovereign state that could do that, right? I mean, we could do a Soviet Union-style totalitarian purge of all private well, we could try, right? But we don't see those efforts. So I think that, I mean, I agree with you. So I think I agree, operational utility, I've just got to change the phrase. Like, I'm still confused by what relative power is or is not doing. So if I'm an ideologically opposed group and I'm really strong, I would expect the state to really come after me. But if I'm a powerful group that's useful, right, I'm the pro-state militia, then I would expect a completely different relationship, holding relative power completely identical between the two. So obviously I need to do a better job with that, but I guess I still don't know what power should be doing for me, right? It seems completely conditional on deeper politics here. And then to your point on ideology, yeah, I take that. The way I presented this didn't give a great account of it. The way I thought about it is as follows. Basically, in periods prior to a regime actually taking power, and especially prior to any kind of interaction in an actual conflict, right? So not looking at the war, not looking at what happens 30 years later, coming up with kind of what is the regime's conceptualization of nationalism. It's usually nationalism. Who's in and who's out, and then among those who are in, is there a hierarchy in terms of citizenship? Okay, so that's how I'm thinking about ideology of the polity, and I think in a lot of cases can be measured prior to any kind of observed conflict, right? Even prior to taking power. I think that's the most methodologically defensible way of trying to cut at it.
What do you do with a group, let's take Iran after the revolution?
Yep.
And the split is between, let's say, within the religious community, the left and the right. So they have agreement on who's in the community, but there's a strong fight among left and right. Is that just not yet?
So what I have to do there is look at the contending strands and basically break it down and say, okay, so which of those strands then emerges victorious and takes control of the state, right? And so it's possible either of those could have emerged victorious, but I would expect to see different patterns of internal security policy emerging depending if the left won or if the right won. But I can tell you which is the left and which is the right ex ante and what I would expect to see after they take power, rather than just looking after they took power and say, well, they targeted these people, so therefore that must have been their ideology. There are cases where you can't do this, where it's really fragmented movements, you don't know what their politics are, and you just kind of give up. So there are cases this can't be made to work.
Which in some of these groups, once in power, what they all agreed on, let's say, is national liberation for the national movement, and they agreed on its boundaries, like in Iran. But once they're successful at that level, then the divisions between them, in this case, clerics who believed in wide distribution of resources versus clerics who were high on private property. So then we had a split, right, within the clerical community between the traditional left and right kind of economic policies, and Bonnie Sauter and the rest end up dead, eventually out of the country, and the right wins. So it could be that you have multiple parts of ideology.
That's absolutely true. I mean, there's a lot of this I'm not going to capture. I did talk about hierarchy within these conceptions of boundaries. So there are the boundaries and there's hierarchies within them. So, okay, great, we've got an Iranian nation. Is it going to be a right-wing Iranian nation or a left-wing Iranian nation? I think that you can find elements of, say, left-right cleavages or other sub-cleavages within broader nationalist movements. And I think you could identify those and kind of generate predictions from them. But I agree, in some cases it's going to be too messy for us to really do much with. So I don't pretend that I can, take this out into the world and magically explain everything. But I think it can give us a much firmer political foundation for understanding how these governments, whichever faction emerges dominant, how they're going to see politics and how they're going to deal with internal security. So that's how I thought about that.
We got to get you out of here.
Okay, could I take a few more questions?
Just one question, but you have to leave at 10 up. So
okay, Chris,
It's not even really a question.
how about Jelpy and then Chris Ray?
Which is just an example that occurs to me that maybe you'll accept as a response to Randy to try to show how your variable of nationalist sort of self-conception, that seems to be how you're describing ideology, matters even in what we think of as highly effective states. If you think of the way that the United States responded to, say, the militias after the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, right, which is, a large threat. But if you think of them ideologically, they're in this sort of green zone area because they're part of this frontiersman mentality that is part of what America is all about, and so they don't get a massive crackdown on them, right? They get pushed back to rural Michigan, and he gets put on trial and stuff. But there's no war on right-wing militias in America. But if ISIS inspires somebody to shoot up a nightclub in Orlando and a company reception in San Bernardino, then because they're they're also a low operational utility, but because they're seen as mortal enemy, they're Islam, they're outside, they're the enemy. Now we have a war on radical Islam. There's no such war on.
But that's because Islam is powerful, potentially very powerful.
No.
Whereas the right wing.
In America? In America?
No, but that's the threat. the threat is that ISIS could be coming together. We're not worried about right-wing groups. We're not worried about right-wing groups.
That's not a thing.
Well, I gotta say one thing. When we start saying that power doesn't matter and we're talking politics, then I gotta ask people what the hell their definition of power is or politics is. Because politics is power with
I'm not
social
saying power
relations.
does matter, I'm
So
saying
you can't
ideology
tell me that power doesn't matter.
No, I can tell you that
Accept that.
power is conditional on deeper politics. If you can tell me, do I attack the strong group or do I attack the weak group? Tell which do I
I
attack?
can tell you, but that'd be a long conversation. We have to have.
Right. So it's not a simple, easy solution. Like, oh, you're a strong group, I'm going to whack you. Right. It's just I don't think power is irrelevant. I just think it's conditioned by it and interacts with these other politics in ways that make it more complicated than just like you're a strong group, you need to be destroyed. You're a weak group, I'll leave you alone, or vice versa, which seems equally logically plausible.
I just got to tell you, coexistence was, that's what Khrushchev talked about with Eisenhower, when we knew we had to coexist because one side couldn't defeat the other. It wasn't that we wanted to coexist, we wanted to defeat the Soviets, but we knew we couldn't, and they wanted to defeat us. So coexistence is when you know you don't have the power to get rid of your enemy. And that's what I'm trying to get at here.
Okay.
It's just simply that. You cooperate sometimes with your enemy when you cannot, when there's not, or you coexist when you can't eliminate them. You sometimes cooperate with your enemy when you have a more dangerous enemy.
Can I offer a caveat or a tweak on that, which is you coexist when the political cost of destroying them would be more than you think is worth it. And I think that's an argument about, in part, an argument about threat perception. It's also about material power. But why would I monopolize violence? This isn't that big a threat. They can be managed. Right? That seems like that's not like you could destroy them if you really, really wanted to, right? The Pakistanis can nuke big parts of the northwest frontier. So it's not that I think power is like irrelevant and stupid and nobody should study power, but I don't think it's just a pure power story here. I guess that's
Pure power.
okay. All right. Okay. Social relations plus power, and I need to bring in the power part more clearly, and I need to address Rick Herman's point about making ideology more of a kind of coherent category that leads to causal explanation. Maybe I can get one more from Chris Ray and then get out of here. Okay.
You can ask a question and we can send you an email.
All right.
So I'm really interested. Thanks. Continue to love the project, Paul. So I'm interested in taking the perceptions of the regime seriously, and specifically where they're coming from, and by implication, how much wiggle room is going to exist.
Yeah.
So I guess I could imagine a situation where the Pakistani military regime, they're accurately perceiving the threat, and we just don't get it. But I took the implication to be that it's actually a misperception that's totally understandable given the historical evolution of the threat perception. But so if that's the case, I mean, why are they, that's a sub-optimizing of utility, right? But utility is one of the axes here that's defining the theory. So is it domestic politics are making it, entrenched, or is it their identity is so built that they really legitimately believe this, they're just wrong?
Okay.
And is that a way, does that create a problem for the utility actors?
He can't answer.
I can't answer. I'm not a misperception person, though. I'll just leave it at that.
All right, let's get
thanks, Randy. Thank you.
Thank you. I want you to get your plane.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Paul, thanks for coming over. Very
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. It was nice to meet you
The
guys.
captain's outside.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have one. Yeah, I know that it's in my inbox. You guys have the study you want me to look at, you can comment on, right? Yeah, I can definitely just send you guys I can definitely do a recommendation for you guys.
Thanks. Okay.
How's it going?
All right. Yes. This is Ohio. 11 months old.
Did I hear you say you were training?
Yeah. Well, my wife does most of the training, but I also bring in once they're doing pretty well, like he is, then I bring in the office. It's a good chance for him to like settle in a meeting like this. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Every day.
I don't understand why this is doing this.
he has a 6 p.m. flight. I was like, I'm getting him out.